Hey there. Welcome to our channel, Sleeping Pill, where stories drift softly into the night. I'm Michael, your companion on this slow journey into sleep. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let this gentle story carry you toward sleep. Tonight, we're diving into one of those stories that sneaks up on you quietly, the kind where you're just going through the motions of ordinary life, and then suddenly you find something that changes how you understand love, how you understand silence, how you understand the weight of words that were never spoken. Picture this: you're standing in an apartment that isn't yours, surrounded by boxes and dust and the accumulated history of someone you've never met, and you're thinking about inheritance, about what we leave behind, about how strangers become responsible for our legacies, whether they want to be or not. You probably won't survive reading about a woman who loved someone so completely that she wrote him into existence across hundreds of pages without ever telling him she existed in his life at all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're watching from somewhere interesting, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're settling in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've inherited an apartment, not because you're related to anyone, not because of blood or family or any of the conventional reasons people inherit things. You've inherited it because your grandmother's friend, a woman you've met maybe 3 times in your life, has left you her apartment in her will. It's strange. It's awkward. It's the kind of thing that doesn't make sense until you're standing in the dead woman's living room, holding a letter from her lawyer, realizing that you're now responsible for clearing out 73 years of accumulated life. The apartment is small, but felt large once. There are bookshelves on every wall, not the decorative kind where someone arranges books for aesthetic purposes, the functional kind where books are stacked too deep, crammed into corners, forming towers on the floor. There's books on philosophy and novels and poetry and history and everything in between. There's a reading chair by the window, worn smooth by decades of use. There's a desk covered in papers and pens and the detritus of someone who spent their life with words. The woman's name was Eleanor Mercer. She was a librarian for 40 years at the city library. She was quiet. She kept to herself. Your grandmother spoke of her fondly, but vaguely. They were friends, but there was a distance there, something Eleanor kept carefully maintained. Now Eleanor is dead, and you're standing in her apartment trying to figure out what to do with her life. You start with the boxes. There are dozens of them, all labeled in careful handwriting. Books to donate, personal papers, photographs, correspondence. You open them systematically, efficiently, trying to sort through a life like you're organizing a library, categorizing, deciding what matters and what doesn't, what's worth keeping and what can be discarded. But then you find the box that changes everything. It's not labeled. It's hidden behind the others, tucked into the back of a closet, like it was something Eleanor wanted to protect but couldn't quite bring herself to throw away. Inside are spiral notebooks, dozens of them, all filled with handwriting that ranges from careful to frantic. Inside are loose pages, torn from other notebooks, covered with crossed-out sentences and marginalia, and the visual evidence of someone trying desperately to say something they couldn't quite figure out how to express. Inside is a memoir, or the beginning of one, or the middle. or the end, you're not entirely sure, because the pages aren't in order, because the narrative keeps doubling back on itself, because Eleanor seems to have been writing and rewriting and revising for years, maybe decades. You sit down on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by boxes, surrounded by books, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life spent mostly indoors, mostly alone, mostly quiet. You open the first notebook. The handwriting is young, looser, more hopeful than it will become. The date on the first page is from 50 years ago. I don't know why I'm writing this. I don't know who I'm writing it for. Maybe I'm just writing it for myself, so that when I'm older I can remember what it felt like to be this age, to feel this way, to exist in this particular configuration of hope and uncertainty. You read the first page, you read the second. By the time you finish the third notebook, it's dark outside, and you realize hours have passed, and you're sitting in Eleanor's apartment reading Eleanor's words, and you're falling into her life the way you might fall into a book, unable to stop, unable to pull yourself out, unwilling to pause even though you're tired and your back hurts and you're reading by the light of a single lamp in a dead woman's living room. Eleanor writes about her childhood. She writes about her parents and her siblings and the library where she first worked as a teenager, shelving books and learning that books were safer than people, that stories were more reliable than relationships. She writes about becoming a librarian because it seemed like a logical extension of this truth. She could spend her whole life around books, could help other people find the words they needed without having to speak much herself. She writes beautifully. That's the thing that strikes you first. Eleanor was a writer. Not professionally, not in any official capacity, but the way she moves through language, the way she constructs sentences, the way she circles back to ideas and examines them from different angles. This is the work of someone who understood words as an art form, as a craft, as a way of being in the world. She writes about loneliness, but not in a pathetic way. She writes about solitude with a kind of reverence, like it's something she chose deliberately, something that made sense to her. But she also writes about wanting connection, about observing people in the library and wondering what it would feel like to be known by them, to be seen, to matter to someone besides herself. The man doesn't have a name for the first several pages. Eleanor refers to him only as he, or the man who comes in on Thursdays, or the one with the careful hands. You read through her descriptions trying to build a picture of who he is, what he looks like, why he matters so much that Eleanor would dedicate page after page to documenting his existence in her life. He comes to the library, that much is clear. He comes regularly, on a schedule, which means Eleanor has memorized his schedule, has arranged her own routine around the possibility of seeing him. He reads in a specific section, philosophy mostly, sometimes history, occasionally fiction that seems to surprise him. He has a leather satchel that he carries his books in. He has gray at his temples, even though he's not old. He wears the same green sweater in winter, the same linen shirts in summer. He has a habit of pushing his glasses up his nose when he's concentrating. Eleanor has watched him. That becomes clear as you read. She hasn't stalked him in any predatory sense, but she's observed him the way a naturalist might observe an animal in its habitat, carefully, respectfully, with the kind of attention that comes from genuine interest. She knows his rhythms. She knows that he always sits in the same chair by the window in the philosophy section. She knows that he takes a break mid-afternoon to get coffee from the cafe in the library. She knows that he leaves around 5 o'clock, gathering his books carefully, checking that he hasn't forgotten anything, then exiting through the front doors into whatever life he lives outside the library's walls. "I don't know his name," Eleanor writes. "Isn't that strange? I see him twice a week, sometimes 3 times if he's working on something, and I don't know his name. I could find out. I could look at his library card application. I could ask one of my colleagues. I could simply go up to him and introduce myself. But I don't, and I think the reason I don't is that knowing his name would change something. Right now he exists in a kind of perfection. Right now he's an idea, a possibility, a character in a story I'm telling myself. If I knew his name, if I heard his voice, if I actually talked to him, he would become real in a way that would probably be disappointing." You're reading this and you're thinking about how Eleanor has already decided the outcome of something that hasn't happened yet. She's already decided that reality will be a disappointment compared to the fantasy. She's already protected herself against the possibility of actual connection by making the fantasy more important than any potential reality could ever be. Page after page of the memoir is devoted to this man. Eleanor describes his reading habits, his mannerisms, the way he concentrates so hard on whatever he's reading that the entire world seems to disappear for him. She writes about what she imagines his life might be like. Maybe he's a professor, or maybe he's a student, or maybe he's someone who reads for pleasure and has the luxury of time. She writes about the books he chooses, trying to decode from his selections what kind of person he is, what he thinks about, what matters to him. She writes about a moment when he almost spoke to her. He was looking for a book, something on Schopenhauer, and he couldn't find it, and he came to the desk where Eleanor was working. He stood there, and for a moment I thought he was going to ask me for help. I could feel him formulating the question. I could see him gathering the courage or words or whatever it was he needed to actually speak to me, and then someone else came up behind him, another patron asking about something, and the moment passed. He smiled at me, apologetically, like he was sorry for the interruption, and then he left. I realized, she continues, that I was grateful for that interruption, because if he had asked me for help, if we had actually spoken, I would have had to be a real person in response. I would have had to use my voice. I would have had to navigate the awkwardness of actual human interaction. And I'm not sure I'm capable of that. I'm not sure I've ever been capable of that. The notebooks continue for years, literally years. You can track time by the dates Eleanor writes on her pages. You can see her getting older, her handwriting changing slightly, her reflections becoming more philosophical, more accepting of the life she's chosen to live. But the man, the unnamed man with the careful hands and the reading habit, he remains constant. He continues to come to the library. Eleanor continues to watch him, and the conversation between them, the connection between them, remains entirely one-sided, entirely in Eleanor's head and on these pages. There are moments where Eleanor writes about giving up. "I'm 43 years old," she writes at one point. "I've never been in a relationship. I've never been touched by anyone except my mother before she died. I've built an entire life around observation rather than participation, and I'm wondering if maybe I made a mistake somewhere, if maybe I should have been braver, if maybe I should have spoken." But then she continues, "And then I come to work and he's there, reading in his chair, and I think about how much more painful it would be to know him and have him not feel the way I feel. How much more painful it would be to have tried and failed than to have simply wondered." You're reading this and you're thinking about the architecture of loneliness, about how we build it sometimes, brick by brick, decision by decision, until we're standing inside a structure of our own making, unable to leave, unwilling to leave, because leaving would mean admitting that we built it ourselves. The notebooks continue. Eleanor writes about the library closing down. She had to help coordinate the transition as it moved to a new building. She writes about wondering if the man would follow them, if he would show up at the new location, or if he would just disappear from her life because the geography had changed. He did show up. He adjusted to the new building the way he probably adjusted to everything, quietly, efficiently, settling into a new reading spot and continuing to read. Eleanor retired from the library at 65. She writes in one of the later notebooks, "I don't know what I'm going to do now." He still comes to the library sometimes. He's retired too, I think. Or maybe he works from home because he comes at odd times now, not on a schedule anymore. But without the library as my anchor, without my job as my excuse to be there, I don't know how to justify seeing him. I don't know how to justify continuing to watch someone who has no idea he's being watched. You've read through the notebooks chronologically now, and you're beginning to understand Eleanor's life in a way that feels invasive, but also necessary. You're understanding her as a person who made deliberate choices, who valued her inner life more than her outer life, who preferred the safety of observation to the risk of participation. You're understanding her as someone profoundly lonely, but a loneliness that she had learned to live with, to romanticize even, to transform into something that felt almost noble. The last notebook is different from the others. The handwriting is shakier, Eleanor's hand trembling slightly as she writes. The dates are more recent, from the last 5 years of her life, and the tone is different too. It's more reflective, more accepting, tinged with the particular kind of wisdom that comes from knowing you don't have much time left. "I'm 68 years old," Eleanor writes in one entry. "I'm thinking about death more now. Not in a morbid way, exactly, but in a practical way. I'm thinking about what I want people to know about me when I'm gone. I'm thinking about what I want to leave behind." She writes about her life, not the fantasy life she constructed around the man, but her actual life. The books she loved, the colleagues who became something like friends, the small apartment she lived in, the walks she took through the city, the meals she made for herself, the quiet satisfaction of a life lived deliberately, even if it was a life lived mostly alone. I wonder sometimes if I wasted my life. I wonder if I should have taken more risks, pursued more connections, lived loudly. But then I think about the peace I've had, the simplicity of my existence, the ability to retreat into my own mind whenever the world became too much. I think about how many people spend their whole lives wishing for that kind of peace, and how I've had it, and how that might not be a waste at all. But then, about 3/4 of the way through the last notebook, Eleanor writes something different. She writes about wanting to tell him. Not wanting to talk to him about philosophy or books or anything conventional, but wanting to tell him that she loved him. Wanting to put words to the thing that had structured her entire adult life. "I'm running out of time," she writes in one entry. "I can feel it. Not in a dramatic way, exactly, but in an old way. I'm old now. I can feel my body changing. I can feel time compressing in a way it wasn't before. And I'm thinking about the fact that I've spent 50 years loving someone who doesn't know I exist, and that seems like something I should rectify before I die." "But how?" Eleanor asks on the next page. "How do you tell someone you love them when you've built the entire architecture of your relationship in your own mind on the foundation of never speaking to them?
How do you suddenly become visible to someone who has never seen you? How do you risk everything on the possibility that they might actually respond when silence has been so safe? You're reading this, and you're feeling Eleanor's paralysis, her fear, her desire to speak mixed with her certainty that speaking would ruin everything. You're feeling the weight of 50 years of unspoken words, of a love that existed entirely in one direction, entirely in Eleanor's private world, entirely on pages in a notebook that no one was ever supposed to read. And then you find the note. You're not sure how you almost miss it. It's tucked between pages in one of the later notebooks, a piece of cream-colored stationery folded in half, addressed in Eleanor's handwriting, but with no name, no indication of who it was meant for. The envelope is old, yellowed slightly, and there's a date written in the corner, from 3 years ago. You unfold it carefully. The paper is fragile, like it's been handled many times, opened and closed repeatedly, read over and over until the folds threaten to tear through the words. Eleanor's handwriting is shakier here, more unsteady than in the notebooks, like these words cost her something to write. I don't know if I'll ever give this to you. I don't know if you'll ever read these words, but I need to write them down. I need to put them somewhere, other than in my head, where they've been living for 50 years, where they've been taking up all the space, leaving no room for anything else. The note is a love letter. That's what it is. It's Eleanor finally saying out loud, or as close to out loud as she can get, the thing that she's been feeling, the thing that's been driving her observations and her careful attention and her commitment to quiet, unreciprocated love. I've loved you for my entire adult life. I don't expect you to understand this. I don't expect you to reciprocate. I don't even expect you to believe me. But I need you to know that you mattered to someone. I need you to know that your existence, your presence in the library, your careful attention to the books you read, the way you pushed your glasses up your nose when you were concentrating, the green sweater you wore in winter, I need you to know that all of these things mattered deeply to someone. She writes about why she never spoke to him. She writes about her own limitations, her own fears, her own preference for the safety of fantasy over the risk of reality. She writes about accepting that her love would never be known, that it would exist only in these notebooks and in her own private world, that it would die with her. But then the tone shifts. The letter becomes less about regret and more about something else. Acceptance, maybe, or a peace, or the particular grace that comes from understanding that love doesn't require reciprocation to be real, that love can exist in one direction and still matter, that the act of loving someone can change you even if they never know you loved them. You've made my life better, Eleanor writes. Simply by existing, simply by coming to the library, simply by being the kind of person who reads philosophy and wears a green sweater and cares about the world in a quiet way, you've made my life better. You've given me something to pay attention to, something to care about, a reason to show up to work every day for 40 years. That's not nothing. That matters. The letter ends, I hope you're happy. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for in those books. I hope your life is full and good and everything you want it to be. And I hope that somewhere in the universe, in some configuration of reality that I can't access, we meet properly, and you know me. And it's exactly what we both needed. But in this life, in this world, I'm content to have loved you from a distance. I'm content to have mattered to you without you knowing it. It's been enough. It's not signed. There's no indication of what Eleanor planned to do with it, whether she was ever actually going to give it to him, whether she was going to leave it for him after she died, whether it was always meant to exist only in this sealed envelope, never to be opened by anyone but Eleanor herself. You're sitting on the floor of her apartment, holding this letter, and you're realizing that you've been given access to the most intimate part of Eleanor's life. You've been made the keeper of her secret, the witness to her love, the person responsible for deciding what happens to these words now that Eleanor is gone. And in that moment, you make a decision. You decide that Eleanor's words deserve to be heard. You decide that her love, even if it was unreciprocated, even if it was imaginary in some ways, deserves to be acknowledged. You're going to find the man. You're going to find him, and you're going to tell him about Eleanor, and you're going to let him read her words. You're going to make Eleanor visible to him, even though she's gone.
Finding him is harder than you expect. Eleanor never wrote his full name in her notebooks. She called him the man, or the philosopher, or sometimes just he, like naming him would have shattered the careful distance she maintained. But she did write details. She wrote about the library, about his reading habits, about the specific section where he sat. She wrote enough that you have a starting point, which is more than nothing. You go to the library, the new building where Eleanor transferred to before she retired. You walk to the philosophy section, and you look for the chair by the window that Eleanor described so many times in her notebooks. There's a worn leather chair facing out toward the street, angled so that someone sitting in it would have a view of both the books and the people moving past outside. This is the chair. This is the spot where Eleanor spent 50 years watching someone read. You sit in the chair. You try to imagine what Eleanor saw from this vantage point. You try to understand the landscape of her longing, the geography of her obsession, the way this simple piece of furniture became the center of her world. The librarian at the desk is young, probably not more than 25, and when you ask her if she remembers a regular patron, an older man who comes in frequently, reads philosophy, wears a green sweater in winter, she doesn't. "I've only been here 2 years," she says apologetically, "but I can ask some of the other staff. Some of them have been here longer." An older librarian overhears the conversation. Her name is Margaret, and she's worked at both the old and new library locations. "Oh," she says when you describe him. "Yes, I know who you mean. Tall man, gray hair, always reading something dense. He hasn't been in for a while, actually. I was wondering if something had happened to him. Regular patrons like that, when they suddenly stop coming, you start to worry." "Do you know his name?" you ask. Margaret thinks for a moment. "I'm not supposed to give out patron information, but he's been coming here for so long, and he's such a quiet, dedicated reader, that I think... Yes, I remember his name from processing late fees once. It's James. James Hartley. He used to come in almost every day. Philosophy mostly, but sometimes fiction. Really thoughtful reader, the kind who actually reads the books instead of just browsing." James. The man finally has a name. Eleanor never knew it, spent 50 years with him, existing as he in her mind. But his name is James, and somehow knowing this makes him real in a new way. It makes him a person beyond Eleanor's fantasy, beyond the careful construction of her imagination. You ask Margaret if she knows anything else about him, where he lives, how to find him. She can't give you that information, she says, but she suggests you check the library's public records, the records of people who've registered for library events or classes. Sometimes people put contact information on forms.
It takes you 3 days of searching through old library records, old registration forms for reading groups and lectures, but you find it. James Hartley attended a philosophy lecture series at the library 5 years ago. The registration form has an address. You're nervous as you write it down. You're nervous because you're about to contact a man whose entire relationship with Eleanor has been one-sided, invisible, existing only in Eleanor's notebooks. You're nervous because you're about to tell him something that will change how he understands his own past, that will reveal to him that someone has been watching him, paying attention to him, loving him from a distance. You almost don't go. You sit in your apartment for a full day, holding the address, thinking about whether this is the right thing to do. You think about privacy. You think about boundaries. You think about whether Eleanor would have wanted this, whether she would have wanted her private love to be exposed, her secret feelings to be revealed to the object of her affection. But then you reread the letter. You reread Eleanor's words about wanting to tell him, about running out of time, about regretting the silence. And you think that maybe Eleanor would have wanted someone to finally speak on her behalf, someone to finally make her visible to him. The address is for an apartment about 4 blocks from the library. It's in a quiet neighborhood, near a bookstore and a cafe, the kind of place where someone who loved to read might naturally settle. You walk there on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying a folder with Eleanor's memoir and her letter, feeling ridiculous and noble and terrified in equal measure. The building is old, probably built in the 1920s, the kind of place that's been renovated several times but still maintains an old-world charm. You find his name on the mailbox, J. Hartley, 4B. You climb the stairs, your heart pounding in a way that seems excessive for what you're about to do, which is simply knock on a stranger's door. He answers the door almost immediately, like he was standing just inside, about to go somewhere. He's exactly as Eleanor described him, tall, gray at the temples, wearing glasses that he pushes up his nose as he regards you with confusion. He's older than Eleanor's descriptions because 50 years have passed, because time has done what it does to all of us. But he's still recognizable. He's still the man Eleanor watched read philosophy in the library. Yes, he says, and his voice is kind, cautious, the voice of someone used to being approached by strangers asking for directions or small favors. I'm sorry to bother you. I know you don't know me, but I found something that I think belongs to you or that I think you should see. It belonged to someone named Eleanor Mercer. She was a librarian at the library that you used to go to. You watch his face change. You watch something shift in his expression, like you've just said a name that means something to him, that carries weight, that has been sitting somewhere in his memory all this time. Eleanor, he says quietly. I haven't heard that name in years. Is she... She passed away about 2 months ago, you say gently. I inherited her apartment. I found some things that I think you should see. He invites you inside. His apartment is exactly what you expected. Books everywhere, comfortable furniture worn smooth by use, a reading chair by the window that probably mirrors Eleanor's chair at the library. You sit in his living room and you tell him about Eleanor. You tell him that she was a librarian. You tell him that she came to the library every day for 40 years. You tell him that she watched him read, that she knew his habits, that she cared about him in a way that she never expressed, but that was real nonetheless. He listens without interrupting. He sits very still, his hands folded in his lap, and he listens to you tell the story of a woman loving him from a distance. I knew her, he says when you finish, Not well, we didn't really talk, but I remember her. She was always very kind. She helped me find books sometimes. There was something sad about her, I think. Something lonely. I remember thinking that she seemed like someone who had built a very small life for herself, and I wondered if she was happy with it. Would you like to read what she wrote? She wrote a memoir. It's not finished, but it's her life, and she wrote about you. You hand him the folder. You hand him Eleanor's notebooks, her memoir, her life's work. You hand him the letter, the unsealed, undelivered letter that Eleanor never actually gave to him, but that has somehow become yours to deliver on her behalf. He takes it slowly, like you're handing him something fragile, something that might break if he's not careful. He opens the folder. He begins to read. You don't watch him read. You look away, out his window at the street below, at the city moving on, at the ordinary afternoon happening outside, while something extraordinary is happening inside this apartment. You're giving him access to Eleanor's love. You're making her visible to him. You're fulfilling a wish she had, but never acted on. It takes him a long time to read through everything. You're sitting in his apartment, and you're watching the light move across the floor as the afternoon progresses. You're listening to the city sounds filtering up through his windows, traffic, voices, the ordinary noise of life continuing. You're thinking about Eleanor, about how she never got to see this moment, never got to witness the man she loved finally knowing about her, finally understanding that she had been paying attention. When James finishes reading, he sets the papers down carefully on his lap. He takes off his glasses. He sits very still for a long time, and you don't interrupt him. You understand that he's processing something, that he's reworking his understanding of the past, that he's suddenly seeing the library, that place where he spent so many hours, through a completely different lens. "I don't know what to say," he says finally. His voice is rough, like reading Eleanor's words has done something to his throat, his ability to speak normally. "You don't have to say anything," you tell him. "No, I do. I need to process this. I need to understand what I'm feeling." He stands up and walks to the window, the same kind of window Eleanor described in her notebooks, the same vantage point that allowed her to observe the world while remaining separate from it. He looks out at the street below, at the library visible in the distance, at the geography of his own life mapped out in front of him. "I loved someone once, a long time ago, before I started going to the library regularly, before Eleanor. I was married, actually, and then my wife died. Car accident. She was 34 years old, and she was crossing the street, and a driver ran a red light, and that was it. My entire life changed in an instant." He pauses. He's still looking at the window, not looking at you, just talking to the air, to the past, to Eleanor's ghost that now occupies this apartment. "After she died, I didn't know how to be around people. I didn't know how to interact with anyone. Everything felt raw and wrong and impossible. So I started going to the library. I would sit in a chair, and I would read, and I would pretend that I was just a person reading philosophy, not a person whose entire world had fallen apart. I would pretend that I was okay. Eleanor was always there, in the background. I didn't know her name, but I noticed her. I noticed that she always seemed gentle, that she helped people find books, that she had this quality of acceptance, maybe, like she wasn't judging anyone, like she understood that people carry things with them." He turns around and looks at you. "I think I knew, on some level, that she was watching me. And I think I appreciated it in a strange way. I think I felt seen by her, even though we never spoke. I think her presence at the library made it easier for me to be there because if she was there being quiet and peaceful, then I was allowed to be quiet and peaceful too. Did you ever think about talking to her? You ask. Every day. Every single day for years, I would think about going up to her and saying hello. And every day I would decide not to, because I didn't want to disrupt the thing we had, which was this quiet understanding. I didn't want to risk ruining it by making it real, by making it social, by turning it into actual interaction. He laughs, but it's not a happy laugh. It's the laugh of someone recognizing a profound irony. Eleanor was thinking the same thing about me, wasn't she? She wanted to talk to me, but she didn't want to ruin what we had, which was this quiet observation. We were both protecting the same thing, this invisible connection, by refusing to make it visible. Yes, you say. I think that's exactly what was happening. James sits back down. He picks up Eleanor's letter again. He reads through it once more, slowly this time, like he's trying to memorize the words, like he's trying to understand Eleanor's voice on the page, like he's trying to reach back through the years and connect with her. Finally. She said she was content. She said it was enough loving me without me knowing. Do you think that's true? Do you think she actually believed that? I don't know, you tell him honestly. I think she wanted to believe it. I think she had constructed a philosophy around her silence, a reason why not speaking was noble rather than just scary. But I also found letters she started to write that she never finished, where she was less certain, where she was grieving what never happened between you. I wish I had known, he says. Not in the past. I couldn't have handled that, I don't think. Not when I was so broken. But later, when I recovered, when I was able to be in the world again, I wish she had told me then. Why didn't you come back to the library, you ask? After you recovered, you stopped going. I did recover, slowly. It took years. And when I did, I realized that I didn't need the library anymore. I didn't need to sit and read philosophy to feel grounded. I had learned to live again. I had learned to be in the world without my wife. And I think I also realized that if I went back, I would have to acknowledge Eleanor, would have to talk to her, would have to risk the thing we had. So I just stopped going. Do you regret that? You ask. James is quiet for a long time. Yes, he says finally. Yes, I regret it. I regret not talking to her. I regret not giving her the chance to tell me how she felt. I regret all the years we spent in the same space, feeling the same feelings, and never bridging the gap between observation and connection. He looks at the memoir again. She was a beautiful writer, he says. I didn't know that about her. I didn't know that she was spending all that time documenting her own life, her own feelings, turning her love into words. I didn't know that she was creating art out of her loneliness. You nod. She was. She was doing that the entire time. While you were reading philosophy, she was writing about watching you read philosophy. You were creating meaning in the same space, just in completely different ways. Will you help me finish it? James asks suddenly. Will you help me finish her memoir? She didn't finish it, but I think it deserves an ending. I think her life deserves to be completed even if she's gone. Even if the ending is just someone reading her words and understanding them and honoring what she created. You look at him, this man who Eleanor loved for 50 years without him knowing, who is now asking you to help him finish her story, who is suddenly understanding that Eleanor's words matter, that Eleanor's life matters, that Eleanor's love, even though it was unreciprocated and unspoken, was real and valuable and deserves to be acknowledged. Yes, you say, I'll help you. Over the next few weeks, you find yourself spending a lot of time in James's apartment. You bring Eleanor's notebooks, her memoir fragments, her letters, her entire private archive of words. You sit at his dining table, surrounded by papers, trying to understand Eleanor's voice, her story, the arc of her life as she experienced it and as she documented it. James reads everything multiple times. You watch him as he reads. You watch the way his face changes as he encounters different passages. Sometimes he smiles, remembering something from the library, recognizing himself in Eleanor's observations. Sometimes his expression becomes sad, recognizing the distance between them, the years they spent in proximity but not connection. Sometimes he laughs, surprised by Eleanor's dry humor, by her ability to find comedy in her own loneliness. "She was funny," he says one afternoon. "I didn't know that. I thought she was just quiet and sad, but she's actually quite funny. Listen to this." He reads a passage where Eleanor describes a patron who came to the library looking for a book on self-help, and Eleanor accidentally directed her to the philosophy section instead. "I think I may have created an existentialist," Eleanor wrote. "I'm not sure if I should apologize or take credit." You learn James as you spend time with him. You learn that he's been alone since his wife died, that he never remarried, that he's spent the last 30 years building a quiet life similar to Eleanor's. Lots of reading, lots of thinking, very little actual human connection. You learn that he's a retired professor of philosophy, which explains his dedication to the books he read at the library. You learn that he has a nephew he sees occasionally, but mostly he exists in solitude, by choice and maybe by accident, in a way that mirrors Eleanor's own isolation. "We would have understood each other," he says one day, "if we had actually talked. We both built lives around books. We both preferred thinking to talking. We both understood that the world is complicated, and that sometimes it's easier to retreat into your own mind than to try to navigate other people's expectations." "Why do you think you never talked to her?" you ask, even after you recovered, even when you were no longer grieving so intensely. James is quiet for a long time. He's looking at Eleanor's memoir, at a particular page where Eleanor writes about the day James almost asked her for help finding a book. "I think I was afraid," he says finally. "I think I was afraid that if I talked to Eleanor, if I acknowledged her, she would become real in a way that would demand something from me. She would become someone I had to consider, someone whose feelings I had to think about, someone who might want something from me that I wasn't capable of giving. It was easier to let her exist as this quiet presence, this person on the periphery of my life, than to actually engage with her." "Do you think she knew that?" you ask. "Do you think she understood that you were choosing not to engage?" "I think she did. I think she understood it very well, which is why she was able to accept it, why she was able to construct a narrative in which her silence was noble rather than painful. She understood my boundaries before I even knew I had them." You're sitting in his apartment, surrounded by Eleanor's words, and you're thinking about how love sometimes means accepting that the other person will never love you back, that the other person might not even know you exist, that you might spend your entire life paying attention to someone who's not paying attention to you at all. You're thinking about Eleanor's grace in accepting this. You're thinking about James's guilt in not knowing. "We should start writing," James says one afternoon. "We should start trying to complete her story. She left it unfinished, and I think the least we can do is try to give her life a narrative arc. Try to find some kind of meaning in what she experienced. What would the ending be, you ask? How do we end a story like this? I don't know yet, James says, but I think we start with her final entry. I think we start with where she stopped writing and we continue from there. We imagine what she might have written next if she had lived longer. We imagine what she might have wanted to say. So you begin. You sit at James's table, laptop open, and you start to write. You write from Eleanor's perspective, trying to channel her voice, trying to imagine how she would have described the end of her life. You write about her accepting her mortality. You write about her finding peace in the quiet she had built. You write about the particular grace of a life lived deliberately, even if it was a life lived mostly in solitude. James contributes passages. He writes about Eleanor from the outside, from his perspective, finally acknowledging her, finally giving her the visibility she never demanded but always deserved. He writes about sitting in the library reading philosophy while Eleanor quietly worked around him, how he now understands that they were both reading, both learning, both building understanding in parallel. The writing is slow and careful. You're not trying to rush it. You're trying to honor Eleanor's voice while also completing something that she started but never finished. You're trying to give her life a narrative that makes sense, that has coherence, that demonstrates that her existence mattered, that her love mattered, that the 50 years she spent paying attention to James were not wasted, but were instead a form of art, a form of devotion, a form of being in the world. One day, James reads something you've written and he starts to cry. Not dramatically, but quietly, tears moving down his face as he reads your description of Eleanor's last day at the library, your imagining of how she felt walking out those doors for the final time, knowing that she would never see James again, knowing that their connection, such as it was, would exist only in memory and in these notebooks that she left behind. "Thank you," he says when he can speak again. "Thank you for helping me understand her. Thank you for making me see what I was too afraid to see while she was alive." "I don't think you should thank me," you say. "I think Eleanor would be the one who deserves thanks. She spent 50 years loving you. She documented that love. She left it for someone to find. She created this opportunity for you to finally know her." You're beginning to understand something important about Eleanor's choice to document her life so carefully. You're beginning to understand that she wasn't just recording her love as a way of preserving it, of keeping it private. She was creating a gift. She was creating something that could be discovered after she was gone, something that could finally make her visible, something that could finally bridge the gap between observation and connection, even if that bridge had to be built after her death. Eleanor's love, you're realizing, was never really unreciprocated. It was just received in a different way than she expected. It was received through her words, through James's reading of her words, through your delivery of those words, through the act of completing what she started. Eleanor's love was calling out across time, and finally, someone was answering.
The memoir is taking shape now. You and James have been working on it for 2 months, and what started as fragments and notebooks is becoming something coherent, something that reads like a complete life, a complete story. You've been meeting in his apartment twice a week, sitting at his dining table, reading passages aloud to each other, debating Eleanor's voice, trying to stay true to what she would have wanted to say. James has become obsessed with it in a way that's both beautiful and slightly concerning. He wakes up early and writes before you arrive. He reads Eleanor's words over and over, trying to memorize her phrasing, her way of thinking, her particular perspective on the world. He started visiting the library again, not to read, but to sit in the chair where Eleanor sat, where she watched him read, trying to understand her vantage point, her view of the world,
the geography of her attention. "I saw something interesting today," he tells you one afternoon. "I was sitting in Eleanor's old spot and I realized that she could see me reading. Not just my face, but my hands, the way I held the book, the way I turned pages. She could see the physical manifestation of my thinking. She could watch my mind work through the movements of my body." You're beginning to understand that James is experiencing something like what Eleanor experienced. He's becoming obsessed with understanding someone through observation rather than through direct interaction. Except in his case, Eleanor is dead, so his observation can never become connection. All he has is her words and the memory of her physical presence and the attempt to reconstruct her experience of him. "Do you think she was happy?" he asks one day, seemingly out of nowhere. You're discussing a particular passage in Eleanor's memoir where she describes a day at the library, the ordinary details of shelving books and helping patrons, and James suddenly asks this question. "I think she found peace," you say carefully, "which might not be the same as happiness, but it might be more sustainable." "I want to find her grave," James says. "I want to visit her. I want to acknowledge her, even though it's too late for her to know it." You help him find the cemetery. Eleanor's grave is modest, a simple stone with her name and dates, nothing elaborate. James brings flowers. He stands in front of her grave for a long time, not saying anything, just standing there, finally paying attention to Eleanor in a way that's visible, that's marked, that's real in the physical world, rather than just in his mind or in her words. "I'm sorry," he says finally. "I'm sorry I didn't know you. I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry you spent 50 years watching me while I was too lost in my own grief to notice you." You stand beside him and you think about how this apology is 50 years too late, but also how it's happening now, how Eleanor's words made this moment possible, how her documentation of her love is finally allowing James to grieve what never happened between them, to acknowledge what could have been. Back at his apartment, you continue working on the memoir. You're approaching the end now, the section where Eleanor stopped writing, where you and James have to imagine what comes next. You're thinking about how to honor her without inventing false drama, how to complete her story without changing its essential truth. James writes a passage about the day Eleanor retired from the library. He imagines what Eleanor would have felt watching her life's work, not the job itself, but the observation, the quiet attention, the love, come to an end because she no longer had an excuse to be there. "I think she grieved," James writes. "I think she went home that day and she sat in her apartment and she grieved the loss of the library, the loss of the routine, the loss of the excuse to be near him. I think she understood that this was the end of something, even though she didn't know that they would never speak, never connect, never have any relationship beyond the one that existed in her mind." You read what he's written, and you think about how James is finally understanding Eleanor. He's understanding her not as an abstract idea, but as a person with feelings, with losses, with the particular pain of loving someone you can't have. The ending is difficult to write. You and James struggle with it for weeks. How do you end the story of a life that was defined by silence, by observation, by a love that was never expressed? How do you provide closure for something that never really began? Finally, James writes something that feels right. He writes about Eleanor's last day, about her sitting in her apartment, looking at her notebooks, understanding that her life is almost complete, that soon she'll be gone, and that the only thing she'll leave behind are these words, these private records of her private love. She understood something important, James writes, as Eleanor, channeling her voice, trying to speak from beyond her death. She understood that the act of paying attention itself is a form of love. She understood that watching someone, documenting their existence, holding them in your mind and your heart, that this is real, that this matters. She understood that love doesn't require reciprocation to be valid. She understood that the feeling is enough. And as she sat in her apartment, surrounded by notebooks, surrounded by the evidence of 50 years of attention, she didn't regret her silence. She didn't regret the fact that he never knew her name, never knew she loved him, never knew that he had structured her entire adult life. Because in the act of loving him, in the act of paying attention, she had loved herself too. She had taken her own pain and her own loneliness, and she had transformed it into something beautiful, something true, something that could outlast her. You read this passage and you cry, not because it's sad, though it is, but because it's true. It's true to Eleanor's spirit, true to what she created, true to the meaning she made out of her silence. I think that's the ending, you say. I think so too, James says. You sit in his apartment as the light fades outside his window, the same geography of attention that structured both their lives. You sit together with Eleanor's completed memoir, with her life finally given narrative shape, her love finally acknowledged, her existence finally made visible. James gets up and walks to his bookshelf. He pulls out a leather-bound journal, one that matches Eleanor's notebooks. I'm going to write something, he says, a response to Eleanor, my side of the story. I'm going to tell her what I wish I could have told her when she was alive. You nod. You understand that this is what needs to happen now. You understand that Eleanor's completion isn't just in the memoir you've written together, but in James finally speaking, finally making his own silence audible, finally responding to Eleanor's 50 years of quiet attention with his own words, his own acknowledgement, his own love that he couldn't express while she was alive, but that he can express now, to her memory, to her words, to the woman who loved him enough to watch him read for 50 years without ever asking for anything in return.
You return to James's apartment a week later, and he's written something. 17 pages. He's filled them with his handwriting, neater than Eleanor's, but with a similar care, a similar deliberation. He hands them to you without speaking, and you understand that these are his private words, his response to Eleanor, his side of a conversation that's now 50 years overdue. You read them sitting in the same chair where Eleanor watched him read, where she paid such careful attention to his existence. James's words are addressed directly to Eleanor. He's writing to her as if she could hear him, as if she could respond, as if the distance between them could somehow be bridged through the act of writing. I saw you, he writes. I want you to know that I saw you. I know you thought I didn't, but I did. I noticed the way you helped people find books. I noticed the way you moved through the library like you were trying to take up as little space as possible, like you were apologizing for your own existence. I noticed you, Eleanor, and on some level, I understood that you were paying attention to me. He writes about his grief, about how lost he was when she was watching him read. He writes about how her quiet presence helped him, how the fact that she was there, calmly doing her work, made it easier for him to sit and read philosophy, to rebuild himself one book at a time. I think I knew, he writes, that you loved me. Not consciously, maybe, but on some level I understood it. I understood that your attention was different, that there was something more than professional courtesy in the way you helped me find books, in the way you always seemed to know what I was looking for before I asked. I understood that I was being seen by you, and that understanding made it easier to exist. He writes about why he didn't speak to her. He writes about his fear, his uncertainty, his inability to connect with anyone after his wife's death. He writes about how Eleanor's silence, the way she never demanded anything from him, never asked him to engage, never forced him to be anything other than what he was, made her the only person he could bear to be around. I think I loved you too, he writes. Not in the way you loved me, maybe, but I loved your presence. I loved your kindness.
I loved the way you existed in the world without trying to change it, without trying to force anything. I loved you from the same distance you loved me, and I was too afraid to admit it, too lost in my own grief to imagine that connection was possible. He writes about the years after he stopped coming to the library. He writes about rebuilding his life, about reaching a point where he thought he was okay, where he thought he had moved past the need for her quiet presence. But I was wrong, he writes. I think I needed to stay connected to you, needed to keep coming back to the library, needed to maintain that invisible thread between us. When I stopped coming, I lost something. I lost the only person who understood what it meant to grieve quietly, to exist on the periphery, to love without expectation of return. He writes about reading her memoir, about finally understanding the depth of her feelings, about realizing that what he had assumed was casual observation was actually a 50-year commitment, a 50-year act of devotion, a 50-year proof of love. I regret so much, he writes. I regret not speaking to you. I regret not taking the risk of connection. I regret not giving you the chance to tell me how you felt. But I also want to tell you this. Your love mattered. Your attention mattered. The way you documented your feelings, the way you turned your silence into words, the way you made art out of your loneliness, that mattered. That changed me, even though I didn't know it at the time. That changed how I understand love, how I understand attention, how I understand the value of paying attention to someone else's existence. You're reading this and you're crying, and you realize that James has finally done what Eleanor couldn't do. He's spoken. He's made his love audible. He's bridged the gap that separated them, even though it's a bridge that Eleanor will never cross, a bridge that exists now only in words, only in the record of what might have been. When you finish reading, you look at James and you say, you should publish this. Both of these, Eleanor's memoir and your response, they should exist together. People should know about this. James is quiet for a long time. I don't know, he says. These feel so private, so intimate. Eleanor never intended for anyone to read her notebooks. She never intended for me to know that she loved me. But you do know, you say. And now she knows in a way that you received her love, that you understood it, that you're responding to it. Eleanor's words have created this opportunity. They've created the possibility of connection even though she's gone. That's powerful. That deserves to be shared. James thinks about it. You can see him wrestling with the idea, struggling with whether it's right to expose Eleanor's private feelings, whether it's appropriate to share something that was meant to be secret. What would Eleanor want, you ask? James smiles sadly. I think Eleanor would want to be known, he says. I think that's what she was doing all along with her notebooks, wasn't she? She was trying to be known. She was documenting her existence, trying to prove that she mattered, trying to leave a record of her life so that when she was gone, she wouldn't be completely erased. Then let's do it, you say. Let's get her words published. Let's make Eleanor visible to the world the way she made herself visible to you through these notebooks. Over the next month, you and James begin the process of preparing Eleanor's memoir for publication. You work with a small press that specializes in memoir, in personal narratives, in stories that don't fit neatly into traditional categories. You select passages from Eleanor's notebooks. You include James's response. You write an introduction explaining how you came to be the custodian of Eleanor's words, how you found James, how this book came to exist. The publisher is moved by the story. This is beautiful, the editor tells you. This is a love story, but it's not a romantic love story. It's a story about attention, about witnessing, about the way we can love people without them knowing it, and how that love can matter, can be real, can shape us, even in silence. James insists that Eleanor's name be prominently featured, that it's her story, her voice that matters. He also insists on including his response, but he wants it to be clear that these are his words in response to hers, that they're in dialogue with each other, even though they come from different times, different places, different understandings of what happened between them. I want people to understand, James says, that Eleanor wasn't passive, wasn't helpless, wasn't a victim of her own shyness. She was deliberate. She was making choices. She was creating something beautiful out of her silence. And I want people to understand that I was also silent, also afraid, also choosing not to connect even though I could have. This isn't a story about one person's secret love. It's a story about two people who both understood something about the world, about connection, about the risk of vulnerability, and who both chose different ways of protecting themselves from that risk. As you're working on the publication, James makes a decision. He donates Eleanor's original notebooks to the library where she worked for 40 years, where she watched him read, where their invisible connection was born and flourished, and remained unnamed until after her death. He includes a letter explaining what the notebooks are, who Eleanor was, what she meant, what her presence meant to him. The library creates a small display. Eleanor's notebooks, protected behind glass. The published memoir, James's letter. A photograph of Eleanor. You found one in her apartment from the 1970s, when she was younger but already had that particular quality of quiet observation, that way of looking at the world like she was taking notes on it. You stand in front of the display with James, looking at Eleanor's life made public, made permanent, made visible in a way she never imagined. You think about how strange and beautiful it is that Eleanor's silence has become a kind of speech, that her private pain has become a kind of art, that her unspoken love has become a kind of legacy. She would have been horrified, James says, smiling. She would have hated being this visible. But she would also have wanted this, you say. On some level, I think she always wanted to be known. I think that's why she wrote it all down. I think she was hoping that someone would find her words and understand her. James nods. He reaches out and touches the glass protecting Eleanor's oldest notebook. Thank you for finding her, he says. Time passes differently now. You're no longer meeting with James twice a week to work on the memoir. That project is complete, published, existing in the world. But you continue to see him. You've become something like friends, or maybe something more than that. You've become two people bound together by Eleanor, by the act of resurrecting her story, by the shared understanding that love can exist in silence and still matter profoundly. James has changed since Eleanor's words became public. He's less solitary. He's started giving talks at the library about Eleanor's memoir, about what it means to love someone without being loved back, about the particular grace of observation as a form of devotion. People come to listen to him. People are moved by his story, by the way he describes Eleanor, by the way he describes himself as the object of her attention. Finally understanding what it meant to be seen by her. But there's something else happening too. James is reading Eleanor's memoir over and over. He's memorizing passages. He's tracing her thoughts, following the architecture of her feelings, trying to reconstruct not just what she felt, but why she felt it. What in her life led her to this particular configuration of love and silence? I'm trying to understand her better, he tells you one afternoon. I'm trying to understand how she built a life around observation. What made her choose that? What made her decide that loving from a distance was preferable to taking the risk of actual connection? Does it matter? You ask. She made her choices. She lived her life the way she wanted to live it. It matters to me, James says, because I think I made similar choices. I think I also decided that distance was safer than connection, that observation was preferable to participation. And I want to understand why. I want to understand what in me made me choose to watch her watch me, instead of just talking to her, instead of just being present with her. He started writing again, not in response to Eleanor this time, but trying to understand himself. He's writing about his marriage, about his wife's death, about the way grief closed him off from the world. He's writing about the library, about the way Eleanor's presence made it easier for him to exist in the aftermath of his loss. He's writing about what it means to love someone without them knowing, not because you're choosing to protect yourself, but because you're so lost in your own pain that you can't imagine asking anyone to bear witness to it. I think I was protecting her, he says one day. I think by not talking to her, by not engaging with her, I was trying to protect her from having to carry my grief. I was trying to spare her from having to understand what had happened to me, from having to hold space for my pain. Do you think she would have wanted that? Do you think Eleanor would have wanted you to protect her from your feelings? I don't know, but I think if I had known then what I know now, if I had understood that she was capable of witnessing my pain, capable of being present with it, capable of loving me through it, I think I might have spoken to her. I think I might have said something. The book has been out for 6 months now. It's had a small but devoted readership. People write to James. They write about their own experiences of quiet love, of observation as a form of devotion, of the particular pain of being invisible to the person you care about. They write about how reading Eleanor's memoir helped them understand their own silence, their own choices, their own complicated relationships with visibility and invisibility. One letter is particularly moving. It's from a woman who spent 10 years in love with her best friend, who never spoke about her feelings, who documented that love in journals that she kept hidden. She writes to James, "Reading Eleanor's memoir made me feel less alone. It made me understand that the love I felt, even though it was unreciprocated, was real and valid and worth documenting. It made me understand that there's a particular kind of courage in staying silent, in respecting someone's autonomy, in loving them without demanding that they love you back. Thank you for sharing Eleanor's story. Thank you for making me feel seen." James shows you this letter and he cries. This is what Eleanor's silence has created. This is what her words have done. They've made other people feel less alone. They've given other people permission to acknowledge their own quiet loves, their own invisible devotions, their own choices to observe rather than to participate. You're beginning to understand something profound about Eleanor's legacy. You're understanding that her choice to document her love, her choice to write it down, her choice to leave it for someone to find, this was actually an act of tremendous generosity. She was creating something that could comfort others, that could help others understand themselves, that could bridge the gap between silence and expression. James decides to start a small reading group at the library. Once a month, people gather to discuss Eleanor's memoir, to share their own stories of quiet love, of observation as devotion, of the complexity of attachment and distance. You attend these sessions, and you're struck by how many people have these stories, how common it is to love someone without them knowing, how isolated people feel in this experience until they read Eleanor's memoir and realize they're not alone. A young man, maybe 25, stands up and says, "I've been in love with my roommate for 3 years. I've never told him. I've spent those 3 years paying attention to him, the way he laughs, the books he reads, the kindness he shows to other people. And I thought I was pathetic. I thought I was weak for not saying something. But reading Eleanor's memoir, I realized that my attention, my observation, my love, it's not pathetic. It's a form of art. It's a form of being in the world. It doesn't require reciprocation to be valid." An older woman talks about how she loved her boss for 15 years, how she watched him from her desk, how she documented his excellence, his kindness, his way of treating people with respect. She never told him, and now we're both retired and I'll never tell him. But reading Eleanor's story, I realized that the love I felt wasn't wasted. It shaped me. It made me a better person. It taught me how to pay attention, how to witness, how to hold space for someone else's existence without demanding anything in return. James listens to these stories, and you can see something shifting in him. You can see him understanding that Eleanor's silence, Eleanor's choice to document rather than to speak, Eleanor's decision to love from a distance, that this wasn't a failure. This was a choice. This was a valid way of being in the world. This was a way of honoring someone, of holding them, of loving them without demanding that they change, without demanding that they return the feeling, without demanding anything except the privilege of witnessing their existence. After one of these reading groups, a woman approaches James. She's maybe 60 years old, with kind eyes and a careful way of moving through the world that reminds you of Eleanor. "I want to thank you," she says. "I want to thank you for sharing Eleanor's story. I want to thank you for making it clear that women like us, quiet women, observant women, women who love from a distance, that we're not invisible, that our love, our attention, our presence matters." James takes her hand. "Thank you," he says. "Thank you for reading Eleanor's words. Thank you for letting her know, through your presence here, that she mattered, that she still matters." You stand nearby and you realize that this is what Eleanor created. This is what her silence produced. This is the legacy of her choice to document her love, to write it down, to leave it for someone to find. She has created a community. She has created connection. She has created visibility, not for herself. She's dead. She'll never know. But for everyone else who has ever felt what she felt, who has ever loved quietly, who has ever chosen observation over participation. Eleanor's unspoken love has become a language that other people can use to understand themselves. Eleanor's silence has become a kind of speech.
A year after the memoir's publication, the library invites James to give a lecture. They want him to speak about Eleanor, about the process of discovering her words, about what it means to be the object of someone's quiet love. James is nervous about it. He's given small talks at the reading group, but a full lecture in front of hundreds of people feels different. It feels like he's being asked to be an authority on Eleanor, to interpret her life, to speak on her behalf. "I don't know if I'm the right person to do this," he tells you. "Eleanor's story should be told by Eleanor." "Eleanor's story is being told by Eleanor," you remind him, "through her words, through her memoir. You're not interpreting her, you're just testifying to what it was like to be loved by her, to be the object of her attention, to exist in the geography of her obsession." You help him prepare. You sit in his apartment, listening to him practice his lecture, offering feedback,
helping him find the words to articulate something that's deeply personal, deeply intimate, deeply true about what it means to realize after someone is gone that they loved you, that they paid attention to you, that you mattered to them in ways you never understood while they were alive. The lecture hall is full. People are standing in the back. The library staff looks pleased. This is clearly resonating with people, clearly touching something in the collective consciousness. James stands at the podium, and you can see him taking a breath, gathering his courage, preparing to speak about Eleanor, about love, about the particular pain and beauty of being seen by someone you didn't know was watching. "I'm going to tell you a story," he begins. "It's a story about a woman named Eleanor Mercer. It's a story about love, but not the kind of love you usually hear about. It's a story of quiet love. It's a story of attention as a form of devotion. It's a story of two people who existed in the same space for 50 years without ever speaking, without ever truly connecting, and yet who were profoundly connected through the invisible thread of observation, of attention, of unrequited love." He talks about meeting Eleanor in the library. He talks about the day she helped him find a book on Schopenhauer, about how her kindness meant more to him than she could have known because he was so lost in grief that any act of gentleness felt like a miracle. He talks about continuing to come to the library, day after day, year after year, finding comfort in the quiet, in Eleanor's presence, in the particular way she moved through the world without demanding anything from anyone. "I didn't know she loved me," he says. "I didn't know that she was paying attention to me, documenting my existence, turning her observation of me into art, into words, into a 50-year commitment to understanding who I was. I didn't know any of that. And when I finally found out, when I read her notebooks after she died, I experienced something like grief all over again. Grief for the connection we never had, grief for the words we never spoke, grief for the love that existed in one direction only, visible only in hindsight." He reads passages from Eleanor's memoir. He reads her descriptions of him, her careful documentation of his reading habits, her attempts to understand what kind of person he was based on the books he chose. He reads her final letter, the one addressed to him, never sent, hidden in her apartment for someone to discover after she was gone. "But something interesting happened when I finally read these words," James continues. "Instead of feeling angry, instead of feeling like I had been violated by her observation, instead of feeling like she had taken something from me without my permission, I felt understood. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone had really seen me. Someone had taken the time to understand me, not in a demanding way, not in a way that required me to perform or pretend or be anything other than what I was. Someone had simply witnessed my existence and held that witnessing as sacred." He talks about how Eleanor's love has changed him, has made him understand love differently, has shown him that the most profound forms of connection sometimes happen in silence, in observation, in the quiet devotion of one person to another. "Eleanor taught me," he says, "that love doesn't require reciprocation to be real. Eleanor taught me that paying attention to someone is a form of love. Eleanor taught me that sometimes the most intimate connection we can have with another person is through the act of witnessing them, of seeing them, of holding space for their existence without demanding that they change, without demanding that they love us back." He talks about the reading group that's formed around Eleanor's memoir, how many people have similar stories, how many people have loved quietly, have observed rather than participated, have chosen distance as a form of protection or devotion or both. "What Eleanor's story has shown me," James says, "is that there are many forms of love. There are many ways to be connected to another person, and sometimes the most honest, the most pure, the most courageous form of love is the quiet one, the one that doesn't demand recognition, the one that doesn't require the other person to know, the one that simply exists in the space between observation and silence, between attention and invisibility. He finishes his lecture, and the silence in the room is profound. People are crying, people are moved, people are understanding something about themselves, about their own quiet loves, about their own choices to observe rather than to participate, to love from a distance rather than to risk the vulnerability of actual connection. When the questions start, the first person to raise her hand is an older woman. "Did you ever consider that maybe Eleanor didn't want her story to be told?" the woman asks. "Did you ever consider that by publishing her memoir, by making her visible, you were violating her choice to remain invisible?" It's a good question. It's the question you've grappled with too. The question about whether it's appropriate to expose someone's private feelings, whether it's right to make visible what someone chose to keep hidden. James thinks carefully before answering. "I think Eleanor made a choice," he says finally. "She chose to document her feelings. She chose to write them down. She chose to leave them in a place where someone might find them. That suggests to me that on some level, Eleanor wanted to be known. She wanted her love to matter. She wanted her existence to be acknowledged. The only way she could do that, given her limitations, given her fears, given her particular way of being in the world, was through these notebooks, through these words that could outlast her, that could speak for her after she was gone. And I think," he continues, "by publishing her memoir, by making her visible, by allowing other people to read her words and understand her, I think we're honoring what she created. We're acknowledging that her love mattered. We're saying that her existence mattered. We're giving her the visibility that she deserved even though she couldn't ask for it directly." The woman nods, satisfied with this answer. And you realize that James has articulated something important. He's articulated the tension between Eleanor's choice to remain silent and her implicit request to be known, between her desire for invisibility and her desperate need to be seen. He's understood that these things are not contradictory, that Eleanor could simultaneously want to hide and want to be discovered, that she could simultaneously want to remain private and want to be known. After the lecture, people line up to speak to James. They want to tell him their own stories. They want to thank him for creating space for Eleanor's narrative, for making it possible to talk about quiet love, for validating the choices they've made to observe rather than to participate, to love from a distance rather than to risk the vulnerability of actual connection. You stand to the side, watching this happen, and you realize that this is Eleanor's true legacy. It's not just her memoir, it's not just her love, it's the community that's formed around her words, the conversations that are happening, the understanding that's being created, the visibility that's being offered to people who have always existed in the margins, who have always watched rather than participated, who have always loved quietly and desperately and without hope of return. Eleanor has become a kind of saint for quiet love. Eleanor has become a patron saint for all the invisible people, all the observers, all the people who have chosen distance as a way of protecting themselves or the people they love. And you're beginning to understand what your role has been in all of this. You've been the translator. You've been the bridge. You've been the person who took Eleanor's private words and made them public, who took James's private pain and made it visible, who created the conditions under which two people who never spoke could finally connect through the medium of language, through the act of witness, through the shared understanding that love, in whatever form it takes, is real and valid and worth honoring. Time has a way of changing things, of shifting perspective, of making clear what was always true but invisible. A year and a half after Eleanor's memoir was published, James does something unexpected. He writes a new book. Not a response to Eleanor this time, but something different, something more. He titles it The Weight of Attention: What Eleanor Taught Me About Love. It's part memoir, part philosophy, part love letter to Eleanor, part reckoning with his own life choices. In it, he documents not just what Eleanor wrote about him, but what he now understands about himself through the lens of her observation. "I think I was broken," he writes in the opening pages. "I think I had been broken for so long that I couldn't imagine being whole. And Eleanor came into my life, though I didn't know she was in my life, and through the simple act of paying attention to me, through the simple act of witnessing my existence, she began to heal me. Not because I knew she was there, not because I was aware of being observed, but because her presence, her quiet care, her invisible devotion, it all worked on me in ways I'm only now beginning to understand." He reads passages from Eleanor's memoir and then provides his own commentary, his own interpretation, his own understanding of what Eleanor was experiencing and feeling and trying to say. But he also writes about his own interior life, his own grief, his own recovery, his own slow return to the world after his wife's death. "I think I owe Eleanor more than I can repay," he writes in one passage. "I think her quiet attention saved my life. I think without her presence in the library, without her kindness, without her willingness to be present without demanding anything in return, I might have stayed broken forever. Eleanor didn't heal me through words, through advice, through any overt action. She healed me simply by being there, simply by witnessing me, simply by holding space for my grief without trying to fix it or minimize it or make it go away." This book is different from Eleanor's memoir. This book is James finally speaking, finally making his own silence audible, finally responding to Eleanor not just with admiration, but with gratitude, with understanding, with the particular grace of comprehending, in retrospect, what someone has done for you. You read this book, and you're moved in a different way than you were moved by Eleanor's memoir. Eleanor's words were about longing, about desire, about the pain of invisibility. James' words are about recognition, about finally seeing Eleanor, about understanding what she offered him, about transforming his grief into gratitude. "I want Eleanor to know," James writes in one passage, "that her love was not wasted. Her attention was not lost on me. Her 50 years of observation, of documentation, of quiet devotion, they changed me. They shaped me. They made me capable of surviving something that should have destroyed me. And now that I know what she did, now that I understand what she was doing all those years, I want to tell her that it mattered. It mattered profoundly. It was the most important gift anyone has ever given me." The book is published by the same small press. It's marketed as a companion to Eleanor's memoir, as the other side of the story, as James' response to Eleanor's observation. Critics respond positively. They write about the particular beauty of two people, separated by silence, finally connecting through language, through the medium of the written word. One reviewer writes, "This is a love story unlike any other. It's a story about two people who loved each other in parallel, without intersection, without ever speaking directly to each other. It's a story about how love can exist in silence, can flourish in observation, can transform people even when they're completely unaware of being transformed." James Hartley's response to Eleanor Mercer's memoir is one of the most moving things I've ever read. It's a masterclass in what it means to finally see someone who has been seeing you. James gives another lecture, this time promoting his new book. He reads passages from Eleanor's memoir and then reads his own response to those passages. He creates a dialogue between them, even though Eleanor is no longer alive to respond. Even though the dialogue is entirely constructed, entirely one-sided in its direction. "I want to read you something," he says to the audience. "This is Eleanor's description of watching me read in the library." She writes, "He sits in the chair by the window, and he reads with such focus, such concentration, that it's like the rest of the world disappears for him. I watch the way his eyes move across the page. I watch the way his face changes as he encounters new ideas. I watch him turning page after page, and I understand that he's looking for something in these books. He's looking for a way to understand his own pain. He's looking for wisdom that might help him survive." He pauses and then reads his own response. "I was looking for something. I was looking for a way to survive my wife's death. I was looking for meaning in a world that had suddenly become meaningless. And I found you, Eleanor. Not consciously, not deliberately, but I found you. I found your kindness. I found your presence. I found your quiet understanding that sometimes the only thing we can do for another person is to witness them, to pay attention to them, to hold space for their existence without demanding that they change or heal or become anything other than what they are." The audience is silent. People are crying. You're crying too, because you're witnessing something extraordinary. You're witnessing two people finally connecting, finally speaking to each other, finally bridging the gap that separated them, even though one of them is no longer alive to hear the other's words. After the lecture, a young man approaches James. He says, "I read Eleanor's memoir, and I read your book, and I want to tell you something. I've been in love with my best friend for 10 years. I've never told him. I've documented that love in journals that nobody reads, and reading your books, I made a decision. I'm going to tell him. I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to speak instead of remaining silent." James looks at him carefully. "Are you sure?" he asks. "Are you sure that speaking will lead to the outcome you want?" "No," the young man says, "I'm not sure at all. It might destroy our friendship. It might make everything awkward and painful. But I've also realized that silence has its own cost. Eleanor paid the cost of silence for 50 years. She documented her love but never spoke it. And I don't think she regretted her choice exactly, but I think she wondered about the alternative. I think she wondered what might have happened if she had been brave enough to speak. And I don't want to spend 50 years wondering. I don't want to spend 50 years asking myself, what if? I want to know. Even if the answer is painful, even if the answer is no, I want to know." James nods. "That's brave," he says. "That's truly brave. I hope it works out the way you want. And if it doesn't, I hope you can find meaning in the act of speaking itself, in the courage it took to break your silence, in the willingness to be vulnerable." Later, you ask James about this conversation. You ask him if he thinks the young man is making the right choice, if he thinks speaking is always better than silence. "I don't know," he says. "I think it depends on the person. I think Eleanor was right to remain silent. Her silence allowed her to love without expecting anything in return, to observe without demanding reciprocation, to exist in a kind of peace that speaking might have disrupted. But I also think the young man is right to speak. His silence was protecting him, but it was also isolating him, keeping him separate from the person he loved, preventing actual connection." What's the difference, you ask? What makes silence the right choice for Eleanor, but the wrong choice for him? James thinks carefully. "I think it's about honesty," he says finally. "I think Eleanor was being honest with herself about what she could bear. She knew that if she spoke, if she risked rejection, if she became vulnerable, It would destroy her. So she chose silence as a form of self-preservation. But the young man, I think he's being dishonest with himself. I think he's telling himself that silence is noble, that observation is devotion, when really what he's doing is protecting himself from the risk of connection. I think he's using Eleanor's example to justify his own fear. So you think he should speak, you say? I think he should be honest with himself about why he's choosing silence. And if he's choosing it because it's genuine, because he really does believe that loving from a distance is the right choice, then I respect that. But if he's choosing it because he's afraid, because he's protecting himself, then I think he owes it.
2 years after Eleanor's memoir was published, you receive an email from the library. They want to create a permanent exhibit. Not just Eleanor's notebooks behind glass, but a full retrospective. They want to include Eleanor's memoir, James's response, James's new book, photographs of the library throughout the years, documentation of the reading groups that have formed around Eleanor's story, letters from readers who have been moved by Eleanor's work. They're calling it The Geography of Attention, Eleanor Mercer and the Art of Observation. They want James to help curate it. They want you to help too. They want you to tell the story of how you discovered Eleanor's notebooks, how you found James, how you brought them together. You stand in the empty gallery space with James and the librarians, and you imagine what this space will become. You imagine Eleanor's words displayed on walls. You imagine people moving through this space, reading her thoughts, understanding her love, recognizing themselves in her story. You imagine the impact this will have, the conversations it will generate, the understanding it will create. Eleanor would hate this, James says, smiling. She would be mortified by all of this attention. But she also created it. She created this possibility. She created this need for her words to be heard, this hunger to understand her, this recognition that her silence was significant. The exhibit opens on a cool autumn afternoon. There are hundreds of people. There are journalists and academics and people who simply read Eleanor's memoir and wanted to learn more. There are members of the reading group that's been meeting at the library for 2 years now, discussing Eleanor's work, sharing their own stories of quiet love. James gives a speech at the opening. He talks about Eleanor. He talks about what it means to be loved by someone you didn't know was loving you. He talks about the particular grace of retrospective understanding, of looking back at your past and suddenly seeing someone you never knew was there, paying attention, documenting your existence, holding you in their heart for 50 years. Eleanor taught me something, he says to the crowd. She taught me that love is not about being known. Love is not about reciprocation. Love is not about the other person recognizing that you care about them. Love is about the act of paying attention. Love is about the choice to see someone, to understand them, to hold space for their existence. Eleanor loved me for 50 years without me knowing it. And now that I know, I understand that her love was always real, was always valid, was always the most generous gift anyone has ever given me. He walks through the exhibit with you, pointing out the different sections. There's the section devoted to Eleanor's early notebooks, from when she first started working at the library. There's the section about the moment Eleanor first noticed James, the first time she documented his existence. There's the section showing how her observations became more detailed over time, how her focus narrowed to this one man, how her entire adult life became organized around the act of watching him. And then there's the section about James's response, his original 17-page letter to Eleanor, passages from his new book, photographs of James reading at the library, sitting in the same chair where Eleanor sat, existing in the same space that Eleanor occupied for so long. Photographs of James at Eleanor's grave.
photographs of James holding Eleanor's original notebooks. The final section is devoted to the impact of Eleanor's story. Letters from readers, stories from people who have been moved by Eleanor's memoir, who have recognized themselves in her narrative, who have been given permission to acknowledge their own quiet loves, their own invisible devotions, their own choices to observe rather than to participate. You read through these letters and you're struck by the diversity of experience they represent. There's a woman who loved her sister's husband for 20 years. There's a man who loved his professor in graduate school. There's a non-binary person who loved their coworker silently for a decade. There's an older woman who loved her best friend's wife, never saying anything, just holding that love inside her for 40 years until she died. Thank you for Eleanor's story, one letter reads. Thank you for making me understand that my love, even though it was unreciprocated, was real. Thank you for showing me that there's beauty in observation, that there's grace in silence, that I can love someone without them knowing and still find meaning in that love. Another letter reads, I read Eleanor's memoir and I made a decision. I decided to tell my best friend how I felt. And you know what? She didn't feel the same way. She said it made things awkward. We're not as close anymore. But I don't regret it. I regret Eleanor's silence more than I regret my broken heart. At least I know now. At least I tried. At least I was brave enough to speak. You realize that Eleanor's story is doing something remarkable. It's creating a kind of permission structure. It's allowing people to acknowledge love that exists outside the conventional framework of reciprocation. But it's also creating conversations about when silence is wise and when it's cowardly, about when observation is devotion and when it's avoidance, about the different forms of courage and vulnerability. James is approached by a woman who's been reading Eleanor's memoir for the 100th time, according to her own count. She says, I want to tell you something. I was in Eleanor's position. I loved someone for 20 years. I never told them. And I've been so angry at myself for not speaking. I've been so angry at my own cowardice. But reading Eleanor's memoir, reading your response, I've started to understand that maybe my silence wasn't cowardice. Maybe it was actually the most honest, the most loving thing I could do. Maybe respecting someone's autonomy, refusing to make my feelings their responsibility, choosing to love them without demanding that they change, maybe that's actually the bravest thing I could have done. James listens carefully. What matters, he says gently, is that you're at peace with your choice. Eleanor seems to have made peace with her silence, but only you can decide if your silence brought you peace or if it brought you regret. Only you can decide if your observation was devotion or if it was a way of protecting yourself from real connection. The woman nods. I think I made peace with it. I think I made a choice to love in the way I was capable of loving, and I think that was okay. I think that was enough. You stand in the gallery and you watch all these people moving through Eleanor's story, all these people recognizing themselves in her narrative, all these people understanding something about love that they didn't understand before, and you realize that this is what Eleanor created. This is what her silence produced. This is the legacy of her 50-year devotion to James. It's not just him. It's not just the connection between them. It's this. It's this community of people who have learned to understand love differently, who have learned to honor observation as a form of devotion, who have learned that reciprocation is not a prerequisite for genuine connection. Eleanor's unspoken love has become a language. Her silence has become a voice. Her invisible presence has become visible, has become public, has become a force in the world that's changing how people think about love, about attention, about what it means to see another person and hold that seeing as sacred. And you're beginning to understand what your role has been all along. You were the translator. You were the one who took Eleanor's private words and made them public, who took the invisible connection between Eleanor and James and made it visible, who created the conditions for understanding, for recognition, for the kind of love that exists in observation finally being acknowledged, honored, and celebrated.
3 years after Eleanor's memoir was published, James makes a decision. He's going to write Eleanor's ending. Not another response, not another meditation on what Eleanor meant to him, but an actual ending to her memoir, an ending written in her voice, imagining what Eleanor would have wanted to say if she had had the time, if she had had the courage, if she had been able to transform her silence into speech. I don't know if I should do this, he tells you. I don't know if it's right to write in Eleanor's voice, to presume to know what she would have said, to complete something that she left unfinished. Eleanor left it unfinished for a reason, you say. She left it unfinished because she couldn't finish it. She left it unfinished because she didn't know how to bring closure to a life that was still being lived, a love that was still being felt, an observation that was still ongoing. But now that she's gone, now that her story is complete in the way that all lives are complete when they end, maybe it's time to write that ending. Maybe it's time to give her words the closure that she couldn't give them herself. James spends months on this. He reads Eleanor's memoir again and again. He studies her voice, her way of thinking, her particular philosophical approach to her own life. He sits in Eleanor's apartment, which has become something like a shrine, a place where Eleanor's presence still lingers, and he tries to imagine what Eleanor would have said if she had lived longer, if she had found the courage to speak, if she had been able to transform her silence into language. The ending he writes is devastating and beautiful. It's Eleanor finally acknowledging her own mortality, finally accepting that her time is ending, finally coming to terms with the life she lived and the choices she made. But it's also Eleanor speaking directly to James, finally addressing him, finally breaking the silence that structured her entire existence. "I'm going to die soon," the ending begins in Eleanor's voice. "I can feel it. Not in a dramatic way, but in the small ways that aging announces itself. The way my hands shake when I hold a pen, the way my eyes tire more easily, the way my body is slowly returning to the earth from which it came. And as I face this ending, I want to say something that I've never been brave enough to say. I want to speak." James has Eleanor acknowledge James directly. He has her finally breaking the silence, finally saying the thing that she documented for 50 years, but never spoke aloud. "There was a man," Eleanor writes in James's imagining. "There was a man who came to the library. He read philosophy. He wore a green sweater in winter. He had gray at his temples and kind eyes, and a way of concentrating so completely that the world seemed to disappear for him. And I loved him. I loved him for 50 years without ever telling him. I loved him in silence. I loved him in observation. I loved him in the act of paying attention to his existence. And I want him to know," she continues, "that his life mattered to me, that his presence in the library changed me, that the quiet devotion I felt for him was real and valid, and the most important thing my heart has ever experienced. And I want him to know that I don't regret my silence. I don't regret the distance between us. I don't regret the choice I made to love him without him knowing, because in the act of loving him, I learned what it means to be human. I learned what it means to pay attention. I learned what it means to hold space for another person's existence. And that changed me. That made me whole. And now I'm dying," Eleanor's ending concludes. "And I want to tell him, whoever reads these words, wherever this message reaches, I want to tell him that it was enough. His existence was enough. His presence in my life was enough. The fact that I loved him was enough.
I don't need reciprocation. I don't need him to love me back. I just need him to know that he was loved. I just need him to understand that his life, his presence, his existence in the world, it mattered profoundly to someone. It mattered to me. When James finishes reading this to you, you're both crying. It's Eleanor finally speaking. It's Eleanor breaking her 50-year silence. It's Eleanor, through James's hand, through James's imagination, finally telling James what she felt, finally acknowledging her love, finally making visible what was always invisible. This is beautiful, you tell him. This is exactly what Eleanor would have wanted to say, I think. This is Eleanor finally speaking. James publishes this ending as a short booklet, a companion piece to Eleanor's memoir. It's called Eleanor's Voice, the ending she couldn't write. It becomes even more popular than the memoir itself because now Eleanor is speaking directly. Now Eleanor is addressing James. Now Eleanor is no longer just a woman who loved in silence, but a woman who has found her voice, who has broken her silence, who has finally spoken. The reading groups at the library change after this. Instead of just discussing Eleanor's observations of James, instead of just analyzing her documentary approach to love, people start discussing what it means to finally speak, what it means to break silence, what Eleanor's ending means for all of them. Eleanor found her voice, one woman says in a reading group. Even though she died, even though she never spoke these words while she was alive, she found a way to speak. She spoke through James. She spoke through this imagined ending, and I think that's important. I think that shows that it's never too late to speak, that even if you can't speak directly to the person you love, you can still find a way to make your feelings known, to make your love audible, to transform your silence into language. A man adds, "But I also think there's something important about the fact that Eleanor needed someone else to speak for her. She needed James to imagine her words. She needed him to channel her voice. She couldn't do it herself, and I think that's okay. I think sometimes we do need other people to help us find our voice, to help us translate our feelings into language, to help us break our silence." James attends these reading groups sometimes. He listens to people discussing Eleanor's memoir, his response, his imagined ending. He listens to people finding themselves in Eleanor's story, understanding themselves through Eleanor's experience, recognizing their own quiet loves, their own invisible devotions, their own complicated relationships with visibility and invisibility. One day, a young woman approaches him after a reading group. She says, "I read Eleanor's ending, the one you wrote for her, and I realized something. I realized that I've been waiting for someone else to give me permission to speak. I've been waiting for someone to write my ending for me, to imagine my words, to break my silence on my behalf. But Eleanor's story taught me that I have to do that for myself. I have to break my own silence. I have to find my own voice. I can't wait for someone else to do it for me." "What are you going to do?" James asks. "I'm going to tell him," she says. "I'm going to tell the person I love that I love him. And I might get hurt. He might not feel the same way. But at least I'll have spoken. At least I'll have found my voice. At least I won't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to break my silence." James smiles. He understands that this is what Eleanor's story is doing in the world. It's not just creating permission for quiet love, for observation as devotion, for invisible connection. It's also creating an imperative to speak, an understanding that silence has a cost, that breaking silence requires courage, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is transform our private feelings into public words. Eleanor's life has become a kind of teaching. Eleanor's silence has become a kind of lesson. Eleanor's 50 years of observation have become a kind of gift, not just to James, but to everyone who reads her story, everyone who recognizes themselves in her narrative, Everyone who understands that love can exist in many forms, that observation can be a form of devotion, that paying attention to someone is one way of honoring their existence. And you, standing at the center of all this, understand that you've been part of something extraordinary. You've been the catalyst for Eleanor's visibility. You've been the translator between her silence and James's recognition. You've been the witness to a love story that transcended death, that transformed through language, that became public in ways that neither Eleanor nor James could have imagined.
4 years have passed since you found Eleanor's notebooks in that apartment. 4 years of watching a love story unfold, of witnessing the transformation of silence into speech, of seeing how one person's documentation of their feelings can change the world. You're different now. You're no longer the person who opened that mailbox out of curiosity and jet lag. You've become someone else, someone who understands the power of attention, who understands the value of witness, who understands how love can exist in the spaces between people, in the silence between words, in the act of paying attention itself. James has aged, not dramatically but noticeably. The gray at his temples has spread. His hands shake a little more when he holds his coffee. But his eyes are clearer than they were when you first met him. There's a kind of peace in him now that wasn't there before, the peace that comes from finally being seen, from finally understanding that his existence mattered to someone, from finally being able to honor that recognition through his own words, his own attention, his own love. He's decided to donate his entire archive to the library, not just Eleanor's notebooks and his own writing, but everything, his personal journals, his correspondence with you, his drafts of his books, the notes he made while reading Eleanor's memoir. He's creating a complete record of this encounter, this meeting between two people who loved each other in silence, this transformation of silence into visibility through the act of documentation. I want people to understand the whole process, he tells you. I want them to see how Eleanor's words led me to write my response, how my response led to the community that formed around our story, how that community led to understanding, to recognition, to the kind of visibility that neither Eleanor nor I could have created alone. The library is creating a research center devoted to Eleanor's work and James' response. They're hiring scholars to study the correspondence between observation and love, between silence and speech, between private feeling and public expression. They're creating a space where people can come to study this particular love story, to understand it, to learn from it, to find themselves in it. You're asked to write an introduction to the archive, an introduction that explains how you found Eleanor's notebooks, how you decided to seek out James, how you brought them together, how this whole extraordinary sequence of events came to pass. You sit down to write it, and you realize how difficult it is to explain your own role in this story, to articulate why you made the choices you made, to justify the invasion of Eleanor's privacy that ultimately led to her being celebrated and honored and understood. I didn't set out to do any of this, you write. I didn't inherit Eleanor's apartment with the intention of disrupting her legacy, of making public what she kept private, of transforming her silence into speech. I simply found her notebooks. I simply read her words. I simply understood that they deserved to be heard. And from there, everything else followed. You write about the moment you decided to seek out James. You write about the fear you felt, the uncertainty, the sense that you might be overstepping, that you might be violating Eleanor's carefully constructed privacy. But you also write about the conviction that drove you forward. The conviction that Eleanor's love was real,
that it deserved to be acknowledged, that it deserved to reach the person it was directed toward, even if that reaching had to happen after Eleanor was gone. What I didn't anticipate, you write, was how this act of witness would transform not just Eleanor's life or James's life, but the lives of thousands of people who would read their story and recognize themselves in it. I didn't anticipate that Eleanor's documentation of her love would become a kind of permission structure, a framework for understanding connection that exists outside conventional reciprocation, a language for expressing the kinds of love that are usually kept private, invisible, unspoken. You write about what you've learned from Eleanor and James. You write about how Eleanor taught you that attention is a form of love, that observation can be a form of devotion, that paying attention to someone is a way of honoring their existence. You write about how James taught you that it's never too late to respond to love, to acknowledge it, to transform your understanding of the past through the act of recognition in the present. Most importantly, you conclude, Eleanor and James taught me that love is not always about being returned. Love is not always about reciprocation or visibility or the acknowledgement of the other person. Sometimes love is simply about the act of paying attention, about the choice to see someone, to understand them, to hold space for their existence. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, if we're brave enough to speak, if we're willing to break our silence, that private love can become public, can become shared, can become a force in the world that changes how people understand themselves and each other. Your introduction becomes part of the archive. Your words, your understanding of this encounter, your perspective on what Eleanor and James created together, it becomes part of the permanent record. You've become part of Eleanor's story now, not as the main character, but as the essential facilitator, the person without whom the meeting between Eleanor's words and James' recognition could not have happened. People write to you now. They write about how Eleanor's memoir changed their lives. They write about how they recognized themselves in Eleanor's narrative and found permission to acknowledge their own quiet loves, their own invisible devotions. They write about how reading Eleanor and James's story helped them understand their own complicated relationships with visibility and invisibility, with speech and silence, with the particular courage required to love someone without expecting anything in return. One letter comes from the young man who decided to tell his best friend how he felt. He writes, "I wanted to update you. I told him. And it didn't go the way I hoped. He was kind about it, but he didn't feel the same way. And yes, it was painful. Yes, things are awkward between us now. But I'm grateful that I spoke. I'm grateful that I took the risk. I'm grateful to Eleanor for showing me that silence, while it has its own kind of beauty, also has its own kind of cost. Thank you for helping me understand that. Thank you for being part of this story." James sends you an email. He writes, "Eleanor's archive is complete. Everything is documented. Everything is recorded. Everything is available for study. And I've been thinking about what happens next. What happens after the documentation is complete? What happens when there's nothing left to write, nothing left to analyze, nothing left to understand? What happens to us, to this community that formed around Eleanor's story when we've exhausted the meaning that can be extracted from her notebooks?" You think about this question. You think about what Eleanor's story has done in the world. You think about how it's created a framework for understanding love differently, for honoring observation as a form of devotion, for recognizing that connection can exist in many forms, that reciprocation is not a prerequisite for genuine relationship. You write, "I think Eleanor's story becomes part of the culture," you respond. I think it becomes a reference point, a touchstone, a way of understanding ourselves. I think people will keep reading her memoir, keep discussing it, keep finding new meanings in it. And I think that's what Eleanor wanted, what she was creating all along. Not just a document of her private feelings, but a gift to everyone else who has ever felt what she felt, who has ever loved in silence, who has ever chosen observation over participation. You realize that this is the end of your active involvement in Eleanor and James's story. You've done what you needed to do. You've been the translator, the facilitator, the witness. You've brought Eleanor's words and James' recognition together. You've created the conditions for understanding, for connection, for the kind of love that exists in silence finally being made visible and honored and celebrated. But the story continues without you now. Eleanor's words will continue to reach people. James' response will continue to resonate with readers. The community that formed around their love will continue to grow and evolve and find new meanings in Eleanor's documentation of her 50 years of attention. You're no longer essential to this story, but you're grateful that you were here, grateful that you were the one who found Eleanor's notebooks, grateful that you were the one who brought James and Eleanor together, grateful that you were part of.
5 years after finding Eleanor's notebooks, you return to the apartment one last time. It's no longer your responsibility. The library has taken over ownership, has converted it into a small museum, a space where Eleanor lived and wrote and documented her 50-year love. But you asked for access today, asked to sit in Eleanor's reading chair one more time, to be in the space where she spent her life, to remember how this all began. The apartment has been preserved carefully. Her desk still sits by the window, still has her pens arranged the way she arranged them. Her books still line the shelves, still hold her annotations, her underlined passages, her private conversations with authors who would never know they were having them. The chair where she sat, the chair that mirrors the chair at the library where James sat, still faces the window, still looks out at the city, still exists in that particular geography of observation that defined Eleanor's entire adult life. You sit in the chair. You look out the window at the city below. You think about Eleanor sitting here night after night, year after year, writing her notebooks, documenting her love, transforming her silence into words. You think about the 5 years that have passed since you found her, since you opened that mailbox, since you decided to become the messenger between Eleanor's private feelings and James's eventual recognition. Eleanor is dead. She's been dead for 5 years now, and she'll never know the impact her words have had, never know how many people have read her memoir and recognized themselves in it, never know how her 50 years of silent observation have become a kind of teaching, a kind of gift, a kind of love that extends far beyond James, far beyond the library, far beyond the geography where she lived and worked and paid attention. But maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe Eleanor knew, on some level, that her words would outlive her, that her documentation would matter, that her silence would eventually become visible. Maybe she knew that by writing it all down, by preserving her feelings, by creating a record of her attention, she was creating something that could change people after she was gone. James is old now. You saw him last week, and he looked fragile, like he's beginning his own journey toward death, his own process of leaving. He's still writing, still thinking about Eleanor, still working to complete the portrait he's been painting of her through his own words and responses and attempts to understand what she was experiencing during all those years at the library. "I won't live much longer," he told you matter-of-factly. "I can feel it. I'm ready. But I want to make sure that Eleanor's story is fully preserved, fully documented, fully available for people to study and learn from after I'm gone.
I want to make sure that her words continue to change people, continue to create understanding, continue to offer a framework for the kinds of love that are usually kept private and invisible. You've offered to help with that. You've offered to be the custodian of his final words, the archivist of his understanding, the person who will make sure that James's perspective on Eleanor is preserved alongside Eleanor's perspective on him. You've become, in a way, the keeper of their love story, not as a participant, but as a witness, as a documentarian, as someone who understands the importance of preserving what they created together. Sitting in Eleanor's chair, looking out at the city, you think about what it means to pay attention. You think about what Eleanor was doing for 50 years, watching, observing, documenting, holding space for James's existence without demanding anything in return. You think about how that act of attention, that commitment to witness, that choice to love without expectation of reciprocation, it was real. It was valid. It was one of the most profound forms of love. And you think about what you've been doing for the past 5 years. You've been paying attention to Eleanor's story. You've been witnessing her love. You've been documenting the impact of her words, the way they've changed people, the way they've created a community, the way they've offered a framework for understanding connection that exists outside conventional reciprocation. In a way, you've become Eleanor, not in the sense that you're in love with someone silently, but in the sense that you've committed yourself to the act of attention, to the choice to witness, to the understanding that paying attention to someone, honoring their existence, holding space for their feelings, that this is a form of love, a form of devotion, a form of being in the world that matters profoundly. The light is beginning to fade outside Eleanor's window. The city is starting its transition from day to evening. In a few hours it will be dark, and Eleanor's apartment will be closed up, will be locked, will be preserved for the next person who comes to visit, to sit in Eleanor's chair, to pay attention to Eleanor's life, to bear witness to the 50 years she spent paying attention to someone else. You stand up from Eleanor's chair. You run your hand along the fabric, worn smooth by decades of use, worn smooth by Eleanor's presence, worn smooth by the physical evidence of her commitment to observation, to attention, to love. You think about how this chair has held her, how it's held James, how it's now holding you, how it will hold countless other people who come to this apartment to understand Eleanor, to learn from her, to find themselves in her story. You leave the apartment and you close the door carefully behind you. You descend the stairs. You exit the building into the cooling evening air. You walk through the city, through the streets Eleanor walked, past the library where Eleanor worked, past the chair where she sat for 50 years, watching James, documenting his existence, holding him in her heart. And you understand finally what Eleanor was doing. She was creating a gift. She was creating something that would outlast her, that would reach people, that would offer them a way of understanding love that they couldn't understand on their own. She was creating, through her silence, through her observation, through her 50 years of careful attention, a language for the kinds of love that are usually kept private and invisible. And you've been privileged to be the translator of that language. You've been privileged to take Eleanor's private words and make them public. You've been privileged to bring Eleanor and James together. You've been privileged to witness the transformation of silence into speech, of invisibility into visibility, of private feeling into public meaning. This is what it means to pay attention. This is what it means to witness. This is what it means to be present to someone else's existence, to honor it, to hold space for it, to transform it through the act of documentation, through the act of telling, through the act of speaking on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. Eleanor's story will continue without you now. It will reach people you'll never meet. It will create understanding you'll never witness. It will become part of the cultural conversation about love, about attention, about the ways we connect to each other across the distances we maintain. And that's beautiful. That's exactly what Eleanor was creating. That's exactly what her 50 years of silence were meant to produce. You walk through the city as the evening deepens. You walk past the lights coming on in windows, past people inside their apartments, living their lives, paying attention to the people they love, choosing visibility or invisibility, choosing speech or silence, choosing connection or distance. You walk with the understanding that you've been part of something sacred, something that will outlast you, something that will continue to matter long after you're gone. Just like Eleanor's love continues to matter, just like James's recognition continues to matter, just like the community that formed around their story continues to matter, just like the act of paying attention, really paying attention, completely and fully, and with reverence for another person's existence, continues to matter. This is what Eleanor created. This is what you facilitated. This is the love story that exists in silence, that was spoken into being through your act of witness, that will continue to speak to people for years and years and years to come.
So, here's where we leave you, drifting now into the space between Eleanor's silence and the words that finally broke it, between James's observation and his recognition, between your role as witness and your gradual fading into the background of this story. The city is settling into night. The lights are softening, the noise is becoming muted, gentler, easier to bear. And somewhere in this city, Eleanor's notebooks sit in a library preserved behind glass, waiting for the next person who needs to read them, the next person who needs to recognize themselves in her story, the next person who needs permission to love quietly, to pay attention, to witness another person's existence without demanding anything in return. James is aging. He's beginning his own journey toward silence, toward invisibility, toward the particular peace that comes from finally being seen, finally being understood, finally knowing that your existence mattered to someone, that your presence in the world changed someone, that you were loved even though you didn't know it at the time. And you're becoming a kind of guardian now, a keeper of stories, a witness to witness, someone who understands that the act of paying attention is itself a form of love, that the choice to see someone is a choice to honor them, that documentation can be devotion, that silence can be speech, that invisibility can become visibility through the simple act of someone caring enough to translate it. Eleanor's words are still being read. They're still changing people. They're still creating understanding, recognition, permission for the kinds of love that are usually kept private. And you were part of making that possible. You were the bridge. You were the translator. You were the one brave enough to break Eleanor's silence on her behalf, brave enough to make her visible, brave enough to believe that her words deserve to be heard. Let that be enough. Let the attention you paid be enough. Let the witness you bore be enough. Let yourself rest now, knowing that you were part of something sacred, something that will outlast you, something that will continue to matter. Sleep now. Dream of Eleanor. Dream of love that exists in silence. Dream of the particular grace of finally being seen.